I'm Sean Paul Murphy, writer, editor, producer, and coronavirus refugee. Just to try to break up the tedium, I thought it'd be nice to, record a chapter of my upcoming book, Chapel Street, which will be published by Touchpoint Press in July of 2020. It's the story of a young man who finds himself straddling the line between sanity and insanity as he battles a demonic curse that has driven members of his family to suicide for generations. I think you'll like it. And here's another thing, it's actually inspired, I should say, by a true story. I grew up in a haunted house, and I had two siblings kill themselves. And a couple years ago, my mother asked me if I thought that the entity in the house could have been responsible in part for the deaths of my brother and my sister. The book Chapel Street is sort of a fictional answer to that. But I'm also working on a series of blogs on seanpaulmurphyville.blogspot.com that deal with the actual haunting itself through a series of interviews with people who lived through it. So feel free to listen to this start of my novel Chapel Street, and drop by my blog spot and check out the true story too if you get the chance. So here it comes, Chapel Street. Prologue. My Mother. My name is Rick Backos, and my story began on September 27th, 2011. I arrived home at St. Helens Street at midnight. The drafty five-bedroom Victorian house was nearly 100 years old. Sheltered by oak trees, it sat on the second highest hill in northeast Baltimore. You could see everything from the skyscrapers in the inner harbor to the smokestacks of distant Sparrows Point from the upstairs window. We moved into the house when I was 3 years old, which was a considerable upgrade from my paternal grandparents' basement. To me, it was a veritable castle with plenty of nooks and crannies to explore. Now, however, its size seemed to mock the diminished state of our family. Lights still illuminated my mother's front bedroom as I pulled into the driveway. No voice greeted me when I stepped inside, but I heard her television playing. I called to her, but she didn't answer. I went to her door and gently knocked. Once again, no response. I announced myself quietly before opening the door. I didn't want to wake her up if she was already asleep. In that case, I would just turn off her lights and television as I frequently did. Her doctors prescribed a dizzying array of drugs since her battle with lymphoma began a couple of months earlier. Her nighttime dosage often sent her on a peaceful night's sleep, provided her television didn't wake her back up. As I expected, I saw my mother, Alice Backos, lying in bed. Her head was cocked towards her nightstand. Her eyes were open. I assumed she was awake. "Hi," I said. No response. Nothing. She didn't even turn to me. Now I was worried. I crept forward. A thick comforter and more blankets than the mild fall night demanded covered her. Her head and shoulders were exposed. She wore red plaid flannel pajamas. One of her arms hung stiffly off the side of the bed. It was motionless. In fact, there was no motion anywhere. The blankets were not rising and falling with her breath. Nothing was. I turned to her brown eyes as I walked forward. They were wide open and they appeared dry, sticky even. They didn't blink, not once. A little pinpoint somewhere deep in my mind registered the fact. She was dead. The rest of me couldn't accept it. My mother was fighting a losing battle against lymphoma with chemo. I knew that much, but the doctors assured me she still had months to live. She couldn't be dead. Not now. Her mouth was wide open too, crookedly. There was a dry, white substance around her lips. It wasn't vomit. It was like she had been foaming at her mouth in her last moments. Now I was close enough to touch her. Her neck was exposed. I reached down to check her pulse, but I couldn't bring myself to touch her white skin. I had a sudden, overpowering thought that it would be deathly cold, and that the cold would never leave my fingers. I hated myself as I pulled my hand back. What if she was still alive? What if she was just unconscious? What could I do anyway? I wasn't a doctor. I had to call 911. I took out my cell phone. As I dialed, my eyes went to the nightstand. All of her yellow pill bottles were on their sides. My first thought was that she had knocked him over while she was dying, but where were the pills? They should have spilled all over the place, but I didn't see a single one. Some of the bottles should have been full. I refilled 2 of her prescriptions on my way home from work that very evening. The truth flooded into my brain. She killed herself. I dropped the phone as I staggered backwards out of her room. I couldn't believe she actually did it. My older brother Lenny had killed himself a year earlier by jumping off the 6th-floor balcony at a hotel in the resort town of Ocean City, Maryland. His death wasn't a surprise. He suffered from bipolar disorder and schizophrenia for nearly his entire adult life. Still, his suicide crushed our family emotionally, my mother most of all. She was never the same afterwards, and now she decided to inflict the same pain on us again herself. How could she? I couldn't go back into her bedroom and retrieve my cell phone. I went downstairs and called 911 from the ground line in the kitchen. Afraid they wouldn't consider it an emergency if I reported her dead, I told them I thought she was in a coma. Then I called my kid sister Janet and gave her the news. I dreaded that call. Janet and I were not close. I resented her decision to escape to college in California, leaving my mother and me to deal with Lenny. Still, there was no one else left to call her. It was my responsibility. When I got her, I told Janet that Mom was dead, but I didn't mention suicide. I didn't want to freak her out completely. She was always the emotional one in the family, and I couldn't handle that now. Not alone. Next, I called my girlfriend Gina Holt. She rushed over from her comfy apartment downtown, where I had spent the evening. She arrived after the ambulance, but thankfully before my sister. Gina was perfect. She stayed glued to my side the entire time, always keeping a supportive hand on my shoulder, back, or arm. Gina seemed genuinely upset about my mother's death, despite the fact that my mom had tried every trick in her considerable playbook to ruin our relationship. My sister arrived right before the paramedics came downstairs to give us the bad news. They also noticed the bottles. Apparently, when a person dies of natural causes, the paramedics have you call a funeral home to remove the body. However, since they now had a suspected suicide, they were taking my mother to the hospital for an autopsy. Just as I feared, Janet became hysterical, alternating almost equally between mournful moaning and angry rants. After they removed my mother's body, the 3 of us sat up all night and drank every ounce of alcohol in the house. Janet left at dawn. I left too. I couldn't stay at the house. I went back with Gina to her apartment. I took the week off from work to take care of the funeral arrangements. Gina took off the week too. For the next month, I rarely returned to the family home. For the first time in our nearly 5-year relationship, Gina and I actually lived together. I assumed it was a preamble to the marriage both Gina and I wanted, but from the beginning our life was marred by vivid nightmares. Each night I imagined waking up to find Gina dead beside me. Sometimes it was present day, sometimes it was in the distant future. It didn't matter when. The truth was undeniable. If Gina and I stayed together, the day would come when one of us would awaken to find the other one dead. I couldn't face that prospect. Claiming I needed space to mourn, I moved out of her apartment and got my own place in a high-rise in Towson. The dreams stopped, but with them the relationship fizzled out too. I was heartbroken, but I let it happen anyway. Call me a coward, but I knew if I stayed alone, I could limit my future pain. Gina deserved better. Ironically, my mother won. The sight of her dead in bed ultimately shattered the relationship she had so long desired to destroy. That was the opening at Chapel Street. I hope you enjoyed it. There are a few chapters available online at seanpaulmurphyville.blogspot.com. Come on and check it out. You can also check out blogs about the actual haunting itself. Stay safe, everyone.